The hammer rose in the auctioneer's hand, and Grace Underwood's heart stopped beating. She stood at the edge of the crowd gathered in the dusty square of Caldwell, Kansas, on a sweltering August morning in 1882, watching everything she had left in this world about to be stripped from her. The Underwood farm, 40 acres of wheat-gold land her father had broken his back and eventually his heart over, was being sold beneath her feet, and the man responsible for it was smiling at her from across the crowd with the slow, satisfied grin of a wolf who had already swallowed the lamb. Victor Crane, land speculator, political puppet master. The man who had forged her late father's signature on a debt document that did not exist until Crane had need of it. "Going once," the auctioneer called, his voice swallowed by the dry Kansas wind. Grace's hands balled into fists at her sides. She had tried everything. She had ridden to the county courthouse in Wellington the week before and begged Clerk Harvey Pittman to look at the deed, to notice the discrepancy in the dates, to see what she saw, a trap, carefully constructed, designed to steal the only thing she had left after her father's death. Pittman had smiled thinly, shuffled papers, and told her the matter was out of his hands. Going twice. She pressed forward, ready to scream, ready to make a scene so public and so ugly that even Crane's Bothan paid-for sheriff would be forced to pause, and then a voice cut through the crowd like a rifle shot. "This farm has already been spoken for." Every head turned. The man who had stepped forward wore a deputy's star on his chest, pinned to a dark canvas vest dusted pale with trail grit. He was tall, taller than most men in that crowd, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of red sandstone, and a pair of eyes the deep, flat gray of a sky 10 minutes before a tornado touches down. His dark hair was pushed back beneath the brim of a wide-brimmed hat, and his right hand rested with practiced ease near the holster at his hip, not touching the revolver, but near enough to make every man within 10 feet acutely aware it was there. Deputy Frederick Townsend. Grace had seen him exactly twice before this moment. Once when he had escorted a prisoner through Caldwell 6 months ago, and once briefer, less certain in her memory, a figure standing still at the edge of her father's funeral, hat in hand, watching from a distance with an expression she had not understood at the time. She understood now that she had not understood anything at all. Victor Crane's smile faltered for the first time. "Deputy Townsend," he said, with the careful tone of a man checking whether his footing was solid before he stepped. "On whose authority?" "On the authority of a legal lien registered with the Sumner County Land Office 3 days ago," Frederick said. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a folded document, holding it up. "Filed by the Underwood estate against any sale pending resolution of the contested debt instrument." "You want to challenge it, Crane. You challenge it in front of Judge Alderton in Wellington, but you will not sell this land today." The auctioneer lowered his hammer. The crowd exhaled as one. And Grace Underwood, who had not cried once since her father's coffin was lowered into the Kansas earth, felt something break open behind her sternum like a dam giving way after years of holding back a flood she had refused to name. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried in public squares, but her eyes found Frederick Townsend's across the heads of the dispersing crowd, and whatever he saw in her face made him look away first, as if it was a thing too raw for him to hold. That was where the story between them began. But to understand it, to truly understand the depth of what it cost them both to arrive at that burning August morning, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the night Grace Underwood rode into Caldwell alone on a horse that was half lame and carrying a grief so heavy it had bent her posture into something she barely recognized as her own. Her father, Thomas Underwood, had died on the 14th of July, 1882. He was 58 years old, and he had worked that Kansas land since 1869, when he had followed the railroad west with his wife Eleanor and a 6-year-old daughter, who had not yet learned to be afraid of distance. Eleanor had died of fever in 1874, which had left Thomas and Grace to work the farm alone through drought and grasshopper plagues, and the slow, grinding economic pressures that squeezed the life out of small farmers all across the frontier. Thomas Underwood died of a stroke. The doctor in Caldwell said so. Grace did not doubt it. Her father had been exhausted for years in ways that went beyond what sleep could repair. But he died leaving one unresolved complication: a promissory note, allegedly signed in his name, for a debt of $800 owed to the Crane Land and Development Company. Grace had never heard her father mention this debt. She had managed the household accounts since she was 16. She knew every dollar that came in and went out of the Underwood farm, and no $800 from Victor Crane had ever arrived, and no $800 had ever been borrowed. But the note existed, and it bore something that looked enough like Thomas Underwood's signature to survive a cursory examination. And Victor Crane had filed it with the county clerk within 48 hours of Thomas Underwood's death, which meant that Crane had known Thomas was dying, or had caused the document to be prepared in advance of an event he was confident was coming. Grace had packed what she could carry on her father's horse, a gray gelding named Absalom who had developed a stone bruise in his right foreleg, and ridden the 12 miles to Caldwell to fight for what was hers. Caldwell, in the summer of 1882, was a cattle town on the verge of a transition it did not yet fully understand. The great cattle drives up from Texas on the Kishom Trail were slowing as Kansas farmers pushed back against the longhorn herds that destroyed their crops, and the town itself was caught between its rough, violent cattle town identity and an emerging civic ambition toward respectability and law. It had a new wooden sidewalk on Main Street and a women's temperance society, and it also had 3 saloons and a reputation for producing more gunfights per calendar year than almost any other town in the state. It also had, as of 4 months prior, a new deputy sheriff. Frederick Townsend had come to Caldwell from Dodge City, where he had served under Marshal Bill Tilghman's predecessor, and developed the reputation of a man who was very good at keeping order without particularly enjoying the process. He was 31 years old. He had a dark past that people in Caldwell talked about in the way people talked about dark pasts in small towns, which was to say, in low voices and incomplete sentences, with significant pauses that invited the listener to imagine the worst. What people said, in fragments: there had been a woman in Dodge City. There had been a tragedy. There had been something Frederick Townsend had done or failed to do, and whatever it was, it had left him the way he arrived in Caldwell, moving through the world with a careful, controlled deliberateness, as if he did not entirely trust himself to react without first constructing a wall between the reaction and the world. He wore his deputy's star the way other men wore old scars, present, unavoidable, but not something he invited conversation about. Grace arrived in Caldwell on a Wednesday evening and went directly to the office of Sheriff Roy Mackey, where she presented her evidence: the debt note, her own ledger records, her observations about the forged signature, and was listened to with the patient, dismissive attention of a man who had already decided how a conversation was going to end before it began. Sheriff Mackey was not a bought man in any crude sense. He was simply a man who had decided early in his career that staying out of the way of Victor Crane's ambitions was healthier and more profitable than inserting himself into them, and he had maintained this policy with such consistency that it had become invisible to him, indistinguishable from simply not meddling in civil matters. "This is a dispute between private parties, Miss Underwood," he told her. "Unless you've got evidence of a criminal act, and a signature dispute is not a criminal act, there's nothing this office can do. You'd need to take this to a civil court. The auction is in 6 weeks, she said. Then I'd recommend finding a lawyer." She could not afford a lawyer. She had $13.40, 2 trunks of her father's belongings, and a horse with a stone bruise. She left the sheriff's office and stood on the new wooden sidewalk of Main Street in Caldwell and looked at the street with the expression of a woman who had run out of roads and was about to start building one from scratch. It was Frederick Townsend who found her there, 20 minutes later, when she had not moved. He had been crossing from the direction of the livery stable when he stopped a few feet away and studied her with those flat gray eyes, which she would later learn were not flat at all, which contained, beneath their surface stillness, a depth of attention that was almost unnerving when it was directed at you. "You're Thomas Underwood's daughter," he said. It was not a question. She turned to look at him with the wariness of a woman who had learned in the past weeks that strangers who recognized her tended to be people Victor Crane had sent to deliver warnings dressed up as condolences. "I am," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I knew your father, not well. I passed through this territory 2 years ago on a fugitive trail, and he let me water my horse and fed me supper." He paused again. "He talked about you. Said you ran the accounts and that you were the sharpest mind on the Underwood property, which he seemed to consider the highest compliment he could offer anyone." Grace felt the familiar ache rise in her chest. She pressed it down. "Did you know about Victor Crane and the debt note?" she asked, because she was not a woman who had time for sentiment right now. Frederick's jaw tightened slightly, just slightly, the first crack in that stone composure. "I know about Crane," he said. "I've known about Crane since my first week in Caldwell. What I know and what I can prove are two different things." "Then help me prove it." The words came out of her before she had fully decided to say them. She watched him absorb them, watched the careful calculation move through those gray eyes, and waited. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He said, "Come to my office tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. And then he walked away. And Grace spent the night on a cot at the Caldwell boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Haverstock, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she had just made an alliance or a mistake, or more probably both. She arrived at his office at 5 minutes to 8 the next morning because she had not been able to sleep. He was already there, and there was coffee on the small cast-iron stove in the corner, and he had a map of the county spread across his desk with markings on it she did not immediately understand. He did not greet her with warmth or pleasantry. He handed her a cup of coffee and said, "Tell me everything about the debt note, every detail you remember, in the order you remember it." She told him. He listened. He did not write anything down for the first 10 minutes, which irritated her, until she realized that he was listening with the kind of whole-body attention that meant he was filing every word in a mental architecture she could feel but not see. When she finished, he picked up a pencil and began making notes, and asked 3 questions, each of which was so precisely targeted at the part of the problem she had not yet solved that she had to stop and recalibrate her understanding of who she was dealing with. The first question was, "Who witnessed your father's signature on any legitimate document in the last 2 years of his life, and can any of them be found?" The second question was, "Is there a specific reason Crane needs this particular land, beyond its general value as farmland?" The third question was, "Do you know a man named Elias Sutter?" Grace knew the answer to the first question. Her father's neighbor, a German farmer named Heinrich Brauer, had witnessed Thomas Underwood's signature on a water rights agreement the previous spring. She did not know the answer to the second question, though she had wondered about it. And she had never heard the name Elias Sutter. "Sutter is a land surveyor," Frederick said. "He's the man Crane uses to prepare his documentation packages. If your father's signature was forged, Sutter either did it or knows who did." He paused, looking at the map. "He's in Wellington right now. I intend to speak with him." "We," Grace said. Frederick looked at her. "We intend to speak with him," she said. Another long pause. The flat gray eyes moved over her face in a way that was not rude but was thoroughly evaluative, as if he was measuring something specific and wanted to be sure of his measurement. "This is not a safe undertaking, Miss Underwood. Crane has people who work for him in ways that go beyond land speculation. A man who questioned one of his deals last year ended up with a broken arm and a sudden desire to relocate to Colorado." "I understand the risk," she said. "Do you?" "My father is dead," she said quietly. The farm he spent his life building is being stolen from his estate. I understand the risk completely." Frederick Townsend looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he picked up his hat from the hook on the wall and said, "We ride at first light tomorrow." What she learned about him on the 2-hour ride to Wellington was not much, because he was not a man who volunteered information about himself, but it was significant. She learned that he had been born in Missouri, the second son of a circuit court judge who had held the law in a regard that bordered on the religious. She learned that he had served as a lawman in 4 Kansas towns over the previous 8 years, each posting slightly more demanding than the last, each one leaving a mark she could see in the careful way he moved through the world. She learned that he drank coffee but not whiskey, which in a frontier town in 1882 was unusual enough to be notable. She did not learn about the woman in Dodge City. Not then. What he learned about her on that ride, she could not fully know because he gave so little away. But she caught him watching her twice. Once when she controlled Absalom through a muddy creek crossing with the calm efficiency of someone who had been riding since before she had good sense, and once when she made a dry, precise observation about the legal implications of forged documents that made him stop mid-sentence and recalibrate something in his expression. Wellington was the county seat, a more settled town than Caldwell with a courthouse and a proper street grid, and the self-conscious dignity of a place that considered itself a step above the cattle town chaos to the south. Elias Sutter had an office on the 2nd floor of a surveying and map-making firm on the main street. He was a small, round-shouldered man in his 50s, with the permanent ink stains of his profession on his right hand, and the permanent anxiety of a man with secrets written into the tension around his eyes. He saw Frederick's deputy star and went very still. "I have no business with the law," he said immediately. "No," Frederick said pleasantly, settling into the chair across from Sutter's desk with the easy authority of a man who was very comfortable making himself at home in spaces where he was not invited. "But you have business with Victor Crane, and I have business with Victor Crane, and that makes us connected in ways I think we should discuss." Grace sat in the other chair and did not say anything, which was the strategy she and Frederick had agreed upon. Frederick would lead, she would watch, and they would compare notes afterward on what they observed. Sutter looked at her, then back at Frederick. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Frederick said. "I'm going to tell you directly what I know, and then you're going to tell me if I'm correct, and then we're going to work out together what happens next." He leaned forward slightly. "I know that Crane uses your surveying firm to produce documentation for land acquisitions. I know that not all of those acquisitions have been legitimate. I know that a promissory note bearing Thomas Underwood's name was filed with the county clerk 8 days ago, and that Thomas Underwood has been dead for 22 days, and that he died without mentioning a debt of $800 to Victor Crane to his daughter, who managed his household accounts for the past decade." Sutter's ink-stained hands moved to the surface of his desk and pressed flat, as if he needed the solidity of the wood to anchor himself. "If a man signed a note, show me the note," Frederick said. Sutter blinked. "I don't have it. It's filed with—" "I've seen the county copy. I've looked at the signature. I've also, in the past 3 days, looked at 4 other legitimate documents bearing Thomas Underwood's signature: land deed from 1869, water rights agreement from last spring, tax filings, a letter he wrote to the Territorial Agricultural Board. His signature has specific characteristics. The letter formation in the capital T and the descender on the D in Underwood are particular." He paused. "The note Crane filed has neither of them correctly. Someone who could replicate a signature but had limited examples to work from produced it. That kind of work has a profile, and the profile matches work I've seen before on other documentation connected to Crane's acquisitions." The silence in Sutter's office was the specific silence of a man deciding whether to jump or wait to be pushed. Grace had been watching Sutter's face throughout this exchange, and she saw the moment the calculation shifted, saw the fear of Crane measured against the fear of something else, something Frederick had not yet named, and she saw Sutter's shoulders drop a fraction of an inch in the way shoulders drop when a decision has been made. "I didn't forge that signature," Sutter said. "I know," Frederick said. "Who did?" Sutter's name for the forger was a man called Cotton Yates, a petty criminal with a talent for mimicry who operated in the space between Crane's legitimate business dealings and his illegitimate ones. More importantly, Sutter told them something else, something that answered Frederick's second question from the day before. Crane wanted the Underwood farm specifically because a railroad survey party had identified the southeastern corner of the property as the optimal route for a new spur line connecting Caldwell to the main Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line. That land, once the railroad was confirmed, would be worth 20 times what Crane was paying for it, and Crane knew the survey results because he had a contact inside the railroad company's Western Division office. Hidden motive. The word organized itself in Grace's mind with perfect clarity. This was not simply a land grab. This was a scheme built on inside knowledge, and it explained the timing Crane had manufactured the debt and moved the moment Thomas Underwood was in the ground because every week he waited was a week closer to the railroad survey becoming public knowledge, at which point the farm's true value would be obvious and the debt scheme would be much harder to execute. "He'll ruin me," Sutter said, staring at his hands. "If I say any of this publicly, if you don't say it publicly," Frederick said quietly, "you will be complicit in the theft of a dead man's estate from his daughter, and you will carry that the rest of your life." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm asking you to make a statement to a circuit judge, nothing more than that. I will make sure the statement is filed correctly and that it becomes part of a legal challenge to the debt note, and I will make sure you are identified as a cooperative witness rather than a co-conspirator. That distinction matters, Mr. Sutter." Sutter agreed. He agreed with the reluctant, cornered quality of a man who had found that the lesser of two fears was preferable after all. On the ride back to Caldwell, Grace was quiet for a long time, turning over the shape of what they had found: the railroad survey, the forged signature, the chain of manipulation Crane had constructed with the patient confidence of a man who expected no opposition. "He was waiting for my father to die," she said eventually. Frederick did not offer a false comfort. "It appears so. He may have known my father's health was failing." She paused. "My father's doctor, Dr. Reeves Crane, is a significant patron of the new medical clinic that Reeves practices at." She thought about this. "I don't know what that means exactly." "It may mean nothing," Frederick said. "It may mean that Crane had advanced knowledge of your father's condition, which would explain the forged note being prepared in advance. It doesn't change what we can prove." He paused. "Don't let yourself chase what you can't prove right now. Focus on what you have." It was practical advice delivered without condescension, and she found she appreciated it more than she would have appreciated sympathy. She had received enough sympathy in the past weeks to drown in. What she had needed, and what Frederick Townsend gave her, was someone who treated her problem as a problem to be solved rather than a sorrow to be managed. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. The horses moved along the road and the Kansas prairie spread around them under a high summer sky so blue it looked painted, and somewhere to the west a meadowlark was producing its liquid, improbable song. "Your father was a good man," Frederick said finally. "Good men's legacies should not be stolen." It was a true answer. She knew it was also an incomplete one, but she let it stand. Back in Caldwell, the situation developed a new urgency when Grace returned to her boarding house and found a note that had been slid under her door. It was not signed. It read, "Drop the challenge to the debt. Leave Caldwell. You have 3 days before this becomes something you cannot undo." She took it directly to Frederick. He read it, folded it, and put it in his vest pocket. His expression did not change, which she was beginning to understand was not indifference but the particular stillness of a man who became more focused, not less, when threatened. "Crane knows we went to Wellington," he said. "He has people watching." "He does." He was quiet for a moment. Where is the German farmer? Brower, Heinrich Brower. His farm is 8 miles north of mine. I want to ride out and speak with him tomorrow. If he can confirm your father's signature characteristics from the water rights agreement, we have a second piece of evidence to bring to Judge Alderton alongside Sutter's statement. Frederick. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt him notice it, a fractional change in attention, not quite surprise but adjacent to it. The note says 3 days. What happens after 3 days? Probably nothing, he said. Threatening notes are usually cheap. They cost nothing to write, and they work often enough that the men who write them find them worth the effort. He paused. But I'll be watching. Watching me. Watching the situation. The gray eyes shifted to the window and then back to her. Go back to Mrs. Haverstock's house. Don't go out after dark. I'll come by tomorrow at first light. She wanted to push back against being managed. She wanted to point out that she was 26 years old and had been managing her own safety on a farm miles outside of town for years. But she also recognized that Frederick Townsend had information about Crane's methods that she did not have, and that the careful, controlled way he assessed every situation was not an attempt to undermine her. It was how he kept people alive. She went back to Mrs. Haverstock's house. She did not go out after dark. She sat at the small writing desk in her room and wrote down everything she remembered about the farm's financial records, every transaction, every notation, building an account of her father's finances that she hoped would serve as a document in the legal challenge. She also thought, with a faint and persistent irritation, about the way Frederick Townsend's voice had softened by the smallest measurable degree when he said he would be watching the situation. And she thought about the Meadowlark on the road back from Wellington. And she thought about the fact that she had not let herself think about anything other than survival and legal strategy for 6 weeks, and perhaps that was beginning to cost her something. The visit to Heinrich Brower the next morning produced exactly what they hoped. The old German farmer, a big-shouldered, slow-spoken man who had been a neighbor of the Underwoods for 11 years, confirmed every detail of Thomas Underwood's signature from the water rights agreement, and confirmed additionally that he had met Victor Crane once briefly, when Crane had come to the Underwood farm 8 months ago to ask about purchasing a portion of the eastern land. Thomas had refused. Crane had left politely. Brower had thought nothing more of it. 8 months ago, Grace said on the ride back. He's been planning this for 8 months. Longer, Frederick said. He'd have needed the railroad survey results to know the land was worth the effort. Those results came out a year ago, I checked. He's been building this for 12 months at least. The depth of the premeditation hit her in a new way. 12 months of Crane watching her father's health decline. 12 months of preparation. A forged document, a compliant sheriff, a bought county clerk, an auction scheduled before anyone who cared could organize opposition. It was a machine built to run without friction, and it had almost worked perfectly. Almost. They filed the legal lien with the county land office, Frederick knowing the procedure precisely, navigating the paperwork with a fluency that spoke to years of working within legal frameworks, and arranged for Sutter's statement to be submitted to Judge Alderton's circuit schedule. The auction was 5 weeks away. The lien would halt any sale pending resolution. Victor Crane did not respond with another threatening note. He responded with a man named Dallas Prout. Dallas Prout was one of 3 hired men who worked for Crane in capacities that existed below the line of official employment, not documented, not acknowledged, available for tasks that required methods unavailable to legitimate business. He was 35, rangy, flat-eyed, and carried a Colt single-action Army revolver with the ease of a man who had carried one for a long time. He came to Mrs. Haverstock's boarding house on a Thursday afternoon, while Frederick was at the sheriff's office filing additional paperwork, and he sat in the boarding house parlor and spoke to Grace in the measured, reasonable tones of someone reciting a memorized speech. Mr. Crane is prepared to offer you $300 for the farm property, he said. Cash, That's generous, given the debt situation. You'd walk away with something rather than nothing. The debt situation is fraudulent, Grace said. She sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, projecting a steadiness she was not entirely feeling, because Dallas Prute had the specific quality of a man who communicated physical capability, the way some men communicated confidence effortlessly, constantly, without needing to say a word about it. Mr. Crane doesn't see it that way. Mr. Crane forged my father's signature on a document that didn't exist and filed it 2 days after my father's death. Prute looked at her with those flat, incurious eyes. That's a strong accusation for a woman alone in a strange town. I'm not alone, she said. Deputy Townsend, Prute said, as if tasting the name. A lawman who's decided to involve himself in a civil matter. There are people who'll wonder about his motives. His motive is law, Grace said. People in this territory interpret law in various ways, Miss Underwood. He stood, unhurrying, replacing his hat. Mr. Crane would like an answer within 2 days. He hopes you'll make the sensible choice. He left. Grace sat still for 1 full minute after he left, breathing deliberately, letting the cold wash of that encounter move through her and out before she stood and walked, with complete composure, to the sheriff's office to find Frederick. She told him everything, the offer, the veiled threat, the mention of his motives. She watched his face through all of it, watched the jaw tighten and the eyes go flat and hard in the particular way she had come to associate with him, confronting something that required a response he had not yet determined. He mentioned my motives, Frederick said. He implied there might be questions about why you were involving yourself. Crane is going to try to have me removed from the deputy position, Frederick said. It was not a frightened observation, it was a tactical one, calm and analytical. He has influence with Sheriff Mackey. If he can create the appearance of a conflict of interest, Mackey has grounds to reassign me or suspend me pending review. Can he do that? He can try. Frederick was quiet for a moment. We need to accelerate the timeline. Get Judge Alderton's review scheduled before Crane can disrupt the process through Mackey. He looked at her directly. I'm going to ride to Wellington tonight and put the filing in front of Alderton's clerk directly. If I can get a review hearing scheduled within the next 2 weeks, Crane's window to influence the legal process narrows significantly. I'll come with you. Not tonight. Tonight I ride alone, faster and with fewer visible stakes. You staying here, continuing to be present at Mrs. Haverstock's, means Crane's attention stays divided. He paused. I'll be back by morning. She wanted to argue. She saw the logic and she hated the logic, which was its own kind of response to something she was not ready to name. Be careful, she said, and the words came out rougher than she intended, scraped across the edges of something that was no longer simply gratitude or alliance. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in the gray eyes that she could not fully read, a recognition perhaps of the same thing she was not ready to name. Then he said, "Lock your window," and walked out. He was back before sunrise. He had obtained the hearing date, August 19th, before Judge Alderton in Wellington. The auction had been scheduled for August 22nd. The lien would hold the auction pending the hearing's outcome. If Alderton ruled the debt note fraudulent, which, with Sutter's statement and the signature analysis and Brower's testimony, was a reasonable expectation, the auction could not proceed, and Crane's claim against the estate would be dissolved. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks before the hearing. In those 3 weeks, several things happened simultaneously, and each of them changed something in the landscape of what was growing between Grace Underwood and Frederick Townsend, in ways that neither of them had planned for, and both of them were quietly refusing to examine too closely. Victor Crane, true to Frederick's prediction, went to Sheriff Mackey with a complaint about Frederick's conduct specifically. The allegation that Frederick had used his deputy's authority to access county records for private purposes, and that he had a personal financial interest in the Underwood property dispute. Mackey called Frederick into his office on a Friday morning, and laid this out with the careful, reluctant air of a man performing a duty he had not chosen. Frederick's response was precise and devastating. He produced documentation of every step he had taken, the lien filing, the visit to Sutter, the records examination, and demonstrated that each action had been taken within his lawful authority. He had visited Sutter as a private citizen, not in his official capacity. He had filed the lien as a legal agent for the estate, not as a deputy. He had examined the county records through the public access process. There was nothing that violated the terms of his position. As for the personal financial interest, he did not own any portion of the Underwood property, had no contractual relationship with the Underwood estate, and could demonstrate through 4 years of income records that he had no undisclosed financial arrangements of any kind. Mackey was left with nothing actionable. He told Frederick to be careful about appearances. Frederick thanked him and left. What Frederick did not tell Mackey, and what Grace would only learn later, was that the visit to Elias Sutter had cost Frederick something. Crane had connections at the state level, connections that reached as far as the Kansas Attorney General's office, and someone in that office had sent an inquiry to the Territorial Marshal's Service asking about Frederick Townsend's conduct in Caldwell. It was not a formal investigation. It was a signal, the kind of signal that told a man his career was being looked at from above, and that the people looking were friends of Victor Crane. Frederick had not told her because he did not want her to feel responsible for a risk he had chosen to take with clear eyes. She found out not from him, but from a letter that arrived at Mrs. Haverstock's address to her, from a man she did not know, warning her that the deputy helping her was putting his star on the line, and that she ought to consider whether a farm was worth a man's career. The letter was unsigned, which told her it came from someone who wanted her to feel guilty without wanting to be identified. She found Frederick at the livery stable where he was brushing down his horse after an evening patrol, and she read the letter to him in the orange light of the stable lanterns without preamble. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then, "Where did you get this?" "It came to the boarding house." "Who sent it?" He took the letter from her and read it himself, which bought him a few seconds. "Probably someone in Crane's employ who thought you'd respond by withdrawing the legal challenge." "Is it true about your position?" Another pause. The horse shifted under his hand. "There's an inquiry," he said finally. "At the state level, it's not a formal investigation. It's Crane throwing weight around to see who flinches." "Frederick," she waited until he looked at her. "You should have told me. It's my career. My concern. It is also directly related to what we are doing, which means it is my concern as well." She was not angry exactly. It was something more complicated than anger, a frustration braided with something that felt dangerously like protectiveness. "I will not have you sacrifice your position for my farm without knowing about it. I won't." He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to categorize, something between surprised and disarmed, as if he had not expected the specific form of her argument. "I haven't sacrificed anything," he said. "Not yet." "Not yet," she repeated. The lantern light moved on his face. Outside, the Kansas evening was producing its summer sounds. Crickets, distant piano from a saloon 2 streets over, the soft complaint of horses settling for the night. In here it was warm and close and smelled of hay and horse, and the cedar oil he used on his tack. And Grace Underwood was standing close enough to Frederick Townsend that she could see the exact way the light caught in his gray eyes. And she was thinking about the fact that this man had ridden through the night to file paperwork to protect a woman he had met a week ago, and had done it without asking for anything, and without telling her what it cost him. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. Not the question she had asked before. This one was different, deeper, asking for the thing he had not given her last time. Frederick set down the curry brush. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "There was a woman in Dodge City," he said. "Her name was Martha. She had a piece of property in dispute not unlike yours. A powerful man, a forged claim, a legal system that looked the other way." He stopped, restarted. "I was a deputy there. I knew what was happening." I documented it. I built a case. His voice was very even, very controlled. I was removed from the case before it reached hearing. Political pressure, same mechanism as Crane is using now. I was told to stand down. I stood down. He was quiet for a moment. She lost the property, and then she lost more than that. She had nothing left, no resources, and the winter of 1879 was very hard. He stopped again. She died in February of that year. The silence was absolute. I stood down when I should have stood firm, he said. I am not making that choice again. Grace did not offer condolences about Martha, because she understood that it was not condolences he needed, and that offering them would diminish what he had just given her, the truth of his hidden motive, the dark past that drove his careful, determined presence in her fight. What she said instead was, "Then we win this together. And you keep your star." He looked at her. The disarmed quality was back in his face, but deeper now, as if the armor he maintained with such consistent effort had developed a structural vulnerability it had not had before. "Yes," he said quietly. They did not touch. They were not yet in a place where touching was something either of them would do without more certainty than the moment held. But something was established in that stable, in that orange light, between those two people who had each been surviving alone for too long, something that was not yet called love, but was absolutely its predecessor, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The 2 weeks before the hearing produced new complications daily, and they navigated each one together with the particular efficiency of two people who had discovered they thought in complementary ways. When Crane successfully pressured the county clerk to delay producing certain records for the legal filing, Frederick identified an alternate path through the territorial land registry that bypassed the county clerk entirely. When Grace discovered that Elias Sutter was considering withdrawing his statement after a visit from Dallas Prout, she rode to Wellington alone, faster than Frederick would have liked. A decision that caused a specific tension between them they managed by not speaking of it directly, and spent 3 hours with Sutter, persuading him with a combination of practical argument and moral appeal that resulted in a written, notarized version of his statement that was now a matter of record and could not be retracted. Frederick was waiting at the edge of Caldwell when she rode back in. He fell into step beside her horse without a word, which she was beginning to understand was his version of expressing something he would not say directly. "He'll keep the statement," she told him. "I know," Frederick said. "I got word an hour ago from the county recorder. You moved faster than I expected. I told you I could handle it. You told me," a pause. "You were right." She looked at him. The corner of his mouth had moved, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. It was, she was beginning to understand, as close as Frederick Townsend came to demonstrating satisfaction, and it was surprisingly affecting. "You worry about me," she said. "I worry about the case," he said. Frederick, another pause. "Yes," he said. "I worry about you." 3 days before the hearing, Dallas Prout made a second approach. This time he did not come to the boarding house. He stopped Frederick on the main street of Caldwell at midday, with witnesses present, and delivered his message with the specific boldness of a man who believed witnesses made him untouchable. "Mr. Crane suggests that Deputy Townsend reconsider his involvement in the Underwood matter," Prout said. "He points out that a deputy who creates legal difficulties for legitimate business interests tends to find his career opportunities limited in the territory of Kansas." Frederick looked at him without expression. "Tell Mr. Crane that the hearing is scheduled and the evidence is filed, and that if he has objections he is welcome to present them to Judge Alderton on August 19th. He paused. "And tell Mr. Crane that threatening an officer of the law, even obliquely, is a mistake he should consider carefully." Prout's flat eyes moved over Frederick with the same calculating quality they had when he had spoken to Grace. "You're a long way from having authority over Victor Crane." "Not as far as you think," Frederick said and walked past him. The night before the Wellington hearing, Grace could not sleep. She was sitting on the small porch of Mrs. Haverstock's boarding house in the thick summer dark at the hour that was past midnight, but before any reasonable person would claim morning, and she was thinking about all the things that could go wrong and several things that had already gone unexpectedly right, when she heard footsteps on the boardwalk and looked up to see Frederick, also apparently unable to sleep, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He sat in the other chair without asking permission. He handed her a cup. They sat in the dark for a while without speaking, which was comfortable in a way she had not expected, and which she suspected neither of them had experienced with another person in quite some time. "Are you frightened?" she asked eventually. "No," he said. Then, after a moment, "Yes, but not of Alderton's decision. I'm confident about the evidence." "Then what?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "What comes after?" he said. "If we win tomorrow, and I believe we will, you get your farm back, which means you go back to your farm." The sentence sat between them with a weight she felt in her chest. "Yes," she said carefully, "that's the point." "I know," he said, "that's the point." He lifted his coffee and drank and said nothing more, and she thought about the way he had said what comes after, and you go back to your farm, as if those were connected concerns, as if what came after was specifically related to her going somewhere that was not here. She thought about this very carefully and then said, "Caldwell is 12 miles from the farm." She felt more than saw the stillness that moved through him. "It is," he said. "That's not a great distance," she said. Another long pause. The summer dark breathed around them. Somewhere a dog barked twice and went quiet. "No," Frederick said softly, "it's not." They did not say more. They did not need to. They drank their coffee in the dark and sat with the understanding that was building between them like water rising, slow and certain, and eventually unavoidable. And eventually Grace went back inside and Frederick walked back toward his office, and in the morning they rode to Wellington. The hearing before Judge Alderton lasted 4 hours. Victor Crane appeared with a lawyer, a polished man from Wichita named Holloway, who had the confident manner of someone accustomed to prevailing through procedural expertise. Holloway challenged the lien, challenged Sutter standing as a witness, challenged the signature analysis, and built his case with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times. Frederick presented the countercase with the methodical precision of someone who had prepared every element down to the smallest detail. Sutter testified. Heinrich Brauer testified, via a sworn written statement that Grace had worked with him to prepare, describing the water rights agreement signature in detail. An independent handwriting expert Frederick had located in Wichita engaged at Frederick's personal expense, a fact Grace discovered later, and that made something ache in her chest, provided testimony about the specific characteristics of the debt note signature that were inconsistent with Thomas Underwood's authentic documents. Grace testified last. She described her father's financial records, the absence of any $800 transaction, the impossibility of a debt her father had never mentioned to the person who managed every dollar he earned and spent. She spoke clearly and without trembling, because she was Thomas Underwood's daughter and he had raised her to speak truth directly and without apology. Holloway cross-examined her with pointed questions designed to imply she might have been unaware of private financial dealings her father had kept from her. She answered each one with specific, documented evidence that made his implications untenable, and when Holloway finally sat down, there was a murmur in the courtroom that she chose to interpret as favorable. Judge Alderton was a small, weathered man who had been practicing law in Kansas since before it was a state. He deliberated for 30 minutes in his chambers and returned with a ruling that was 3 sentences long. The debt instrument bearing the name of Thomas Underwood, filed with the Sumner County Clerk on July 22, 1882, was found to contain a signature inconsistent with authentic examples of the deceased's documented hand, and was therefore insufficient to establish a valid debt claim against the Underwood estate. The lien placed on any sale of the Underwood farm property would remain in effect pending further investigation. Victor Crane's claim against the estate was dismissed. The auction scheduled for August 22nd was canceled. Grace sat very still in the courtroom for a long moment after Alderton's clerk finished reading the ruling. Frederick, seated beside her, did not move either. Then she turned and looked at him, and he was already looking at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, something that was relief and satisfaction and something else, something older and more private, that she recognized because she was feeling a version of it herself. She put her hand over his on the table between them. Just that, a hand placed over a hand. He looked down at their hands and then back at her face, and whatever the last wall between them was made of, she saw it come down in his eyes in that moment quietly, without drama, like a door finally opened from the inside. Outside the Wellington courthouse, in the sharp August sunshine, Crane spoke to his lawyer in a low, furious voice while Dallas Prout stood at a distance, watching Frederick with those flat eyes. But the watching had changed quality. It was no longer the assessment of a threat to be managed. It was the watchfulness of a man who had recognized that a particular battle was over. Grace and Frederick walked to where their horses were tied, and the Kansas sky above them was enormous and blue and implacable. "It's done," she said. "This part," he said. "Crane will face a perjury investigation over the note. I've already submitted the handwriting report to the Territorial Marshal's office. He won't walk away from this entirely." "I'm not talking about Crane," she said. He looked at her. "I mean the farm," she said. "This part is done. I can go home." "Yes," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "When do you intend to leave?" "Tomorrow morning, I think." She studied his face. "Will you ride out to the farm to see it?" she said. "You've been fighting for it for 6 weeks. You've never seen it." Something shifted in his expression, something that was almost a full smile. "Yes," he said. "I'd like to see it." On the ride back to Caldwell that evening, through the long golden light of a Kansas August afternoon, they talked in a different way than they had before, not about strategy or evidence or legal procedure, but about smaller things, more personal things, the kind of conversation that happened between two people who had just survived something together and were discovering that the landscape on the other side of survival was unexpectedly pleasant. He told her that he had a younger brother in Missouri who was studying to be a doctor, and that they corresponded infrequently but with genuine warmth. She told him that she had planted an apple orchard on the farm's western edge 5 years ago, and that it had produced its first real crop this past spring, and that she had canned 40 jars of applesauce that were currently in the storm cellar waiting for her return. He told her he had never eaten homemade applesauce. She told him this was a deficiency she was prepared to address. He laughed. It was a quiet laugh, low and genuine, the laugh of a man who did not use it often enough, and Grace felt it move through her like the first warm day after a long winter. The next morning he rode out to the Underwood farm. He arrived at mid-morning, when the summer light was still gentle enough to be kind, and Grace met him at the gate on the lane that led from the road to the farmhouse. A small, solid house her father had built in 2 stages, with a porch that faced east to catch the morning. The 40 acres spread around it in every direction, the wheat mostly harvested but the fields still gold-stubbled, and the apple orchard on the western edge was dark green and heavy with summer. Frederick stood at the fence and looked at it for a long time. She stood beside him and watched him look. "It's a good piece of land," he said. "It's home," she said. He turned and looked at her with those gray eyes, and in the full Kansas morning light she could see everything in them that he had been careful about showing: the admiration, the warmth, the thing that was not yet spoken but was as present and solid as the ground under their feet. "Grace," he said. "Yes," she said before he finished whatever he was going to say, because she knew what it was going to be and she did not want him to lose his nerve by overthinking it, and she was not interested in waiting any longer than necessary. He blinked. "I haven't asked anything yet. You were going to ask if you could call on me, properly, regularly." She met his gaze steadily. "The answer is yes." A pause. Then the smile, the full one this time, not just the territory adjacent to it, the actual smile that transformed his serious, angular face into something that made her breath catch. "I was also going to say that Caldwell is 12 miles away," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm the one who pointed that out." He reached out and took her hand the first time he had done so, the first deliberate, intentional touch, and held it with a gentleness that was somehow more moving than anything dramatic would have been. "I would very much like to call on you," he said, "properly and regularly." "Then you should," she said, "and you should plan to stay for supper the first time, because I intend to make applesauce and I will not have you taste it and then immediately ride away." He laughed again, that low, genuine laugh, and held her hand in the Kansas morning light, and the farm spread around them unhurried and golden. And it was, Grace thought, one of the most quietly perfect moments she had experienced in all her 26 years. What followed was a courtship that happened at the pace of two people who were both, in their different ways, unaccustomed to allowing themselves something simply because they wanted it. Frederick rode out from Caldwell twice a week through the rest of August and into September, and each visit extended a little longer than the last first supper. Then the walk she took each evening around the farm's perimeter to check the fences and evaluate the fields. Then the long conversations on the east-facing porch as the stars came out and the prairie dark settled in around them. He helped her with things he was less skilled at and learned from her without embarrassment. She had 100 practical knowledges he lacked: how to read the wheat's color for disease, how to manage the water from the small creek that crossed the north field, how to negotiate with the grain buyer in Caldwell for a fair price rather than the first price offered, and she shared them freely, without making a performance of sharing. He noticed this and appreciated it. He had known women who weaponized knowledge as a form of control, and Grace did the opposite. She gave information the way she had received it, as a tool meant to be used. He brought things too. He brought news from Caldwell, the progress of the investigation into Crane's forgery scheme, which was slowly and satisfyingly producing consequences. The departure of Dallas Pruitt, who had apparently concluded that Caldwell was no longer a safe working environment. The general civic improvements that were making the town incrementally more civilized. He brought once a book he thought she might like, a collection of botanical essays he had found at the dry goods store in Wellington, which he had purchased because he had heard her mention once briefly that she had been interested in botany as a girl. She was surprised he had remembered. He seemed mildly surprised that she was surprised. He also, gradually and with the patience of a man who understood that some doors had to be opened slowly, told her more about himself, about his father, the circuit court judge, and the way the law had been a kind of religion in the Townsend household, a faith in ordered process and verifiable truth that Frederick had inherited, though his version of it was less ecclesiastical and more pragmatic than his father's had been. About his 8 years moving between Kansas cattle towns, the specific education in human nature that came from working law in places where law was still being established rather than simply maintained. About Martha, not just the bare fact of it, but the texture of the grief and the guilt and the slow, hard work of forgiving himself enough to continue to be useful. She listened to all of it. She did not offer easy comfort or easy judgment. She responded to him the way she responded to everything, with directness and care, which were not opposites in her hands the way they sometimes were in other people's. October came and the Kansas autumn arrived in its characteristic way. Abruptly, beautifully, a cold front from the north that turned the cottonwoods yellow almost overnight and put a clarity into the air that made distances look impossible. Grace harvested the last of the apple orchard and put up the remainder of the summer canning, and began the process of preparing the farm for winter. Frederick, watching her work through the crisp October days, found himself experiencing something he had not felt in a long time: the specific pleasure of watching someone be entirely and uncomplicatedly themselves, in a space they belonged to. He also found himself, with increasing frequency and intensity, thinking about Caldwell being 12 miles away and what it would mean to not be 12 miles away. He proposed to her on an October evening on the east-facing porch, as the sky went from orange to rose to purple with the particular theatrical extravagance of a Kansas sunset. He did not get down on one knee because the porch boards were uneven, and he was realistic about himself. But he held her hands and spoke directly and honestly, which was the only way he knew how to do anything important. He told her that he had not expected to find what he had found in her, had not, in honesty, believed he was still capable of finding it. He told her that he wanted to be on this farm with her, not 12 miles away. He told her that he was aware he was a complicated man with a complicated history, and that he was not pretending otherwise, and that if she needed more time to be certain, he would wait. He told her he loved her. Grace Underwood looked at this serious, gray-eyed, endlessly careful man who had stepped into the highest moment of crisis in her life, and said, "This farm has already been spoken for," with the absolute conviction of someone willing to put everything on the line for a principle. And she thought about every conversation they had had, every morning she had woken up knowing he was 12 miles away, and found that thought immediately followed by the knowledge that he was coming in 2 days. Every quiet moment on the porch and every laugh she had gotten out of him, which she was beginning to consider one of her finest achievements. "I don't need more time," she said. "I've been certain for longer than I've been willing to admit it." She kissed him. She took the initiative, because he was a man who needed to be sure of his welcome, and she wanted there to be no ambiguity whatsoever. He kissed her back with the particular quality of someone who had been holding something very carefully for a long time, and had been finally given permission to put it down and be fully present, and the Kansas sunset performed its extravagant finale around them, and the apple orchard was dark and sweet-scented in the evening air. They were married in November in the small Methodist church in Caldwell, with Mrs. Haverstock and Heinrich Brower in attendance, and the minister who had also presided over Thomas Underwood's funeral service, which Grace found fitting. Frederick wore his best suit, and the deputy's star polished to a brightness she had not seen before. Grace wore her mother's brooch on a blue wool dress she had made herself, because she was capable of making things she needed, and the ceremony was short and sincere and exactly right. Victor Crane's perjury investigation concluded the following spring. He was found liable in a civil proceeding for the fraudulent debt claim. The criminal proceedings were more complicated, as they often were when powerful men had access to lawyers. But he was required to pay restitution, lost several of his other land acquisitions that had been obtained through similar means, and departed Caldwell with considerably less standing than he had arrived with. Cotton Yates, the forger, served a brief sentence in the Sumner County Jail. Elias Sutter gave up his surveying practice and moved to Colorado, which was perhaps not the most dramatic form of justice but was something. The railroad spur did come. It was confirmed officially in the spring of 1883, and construction began that summer. The southeastern corner of the Underwood farm, of the Townsend farm, as people in the territory now called it, was indeed in its path, but the railroad was legally obligated to purchase that portion of the land at fair market value, which was significantly higher than anything Crane had planned to offer. The money from that purchase funded a new barn, repairs to the farmhouse that Thomas Underwood had deferred for years, and an extension of the apple orchard on the western edge that doubled its productive capacity. Frederick kept his deputy position through the winter and into the following year, commuting between the farm and Caldwell on the days he worked his patrol, a route that was well within reasonable riding distance, and that he navigated with the easy competence of a man who was comfortable with practical arrangements. In the spring of 1884, Sheriff Mackey retired, moved to St. Louis to live near his sister, he said, and the county commissioners offered Frederick the sheriff's position. He talked to Grace about it the night after the offer came, sitting at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, with the lamp between them and the winter wind, making its seasonal argument against the window glass. "It's more responsibility," he said. "More time in Caldwell during busy periods." "It's also right," she said. "You're the best lawman in this county and everyone knows it. I'm asking what you think." She looked at him across the lamp. He was 33 years old, and the serious planes of his face had softened, barely perceptibly, over the year and a half of their marriage, something in his expression that was not there before, the faint permanent echo of having something worth coming home to. "I think you should take it," she said. "I think Caldwell will be a better town for having you as sheriff, and I think you would go quiet inside if you stopped doing the work you're meant to do." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You'll be alone out here more days." "Frederick," she said, patient and cert, "I ran this farm alone for years before you arrived. I am not fragile." "I know you're not fragile, I know that." He looked at her. "I simply prefer your company to the alternative." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the same gesture she had made in the Wellington courtroom, which had become its own language between them. "Take the position," she said. "Come home to me when you can, and know I will be here when you do. That is not a complicated arrangement." He took the position. In the spring of 1884, Grace discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Frederick on a Sunday morning when he was home for the full day, standing in the kitchen with the spring light coming through the window over the pump, and she watched his face go through several things simultaneously. The careful restraint he maintained on large emotions, the something underneath the restraint that was too large for restraint, and finally the full, unguarded light of a happiness he did not try to contain. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her with the particular careful intensity of a man who was afraid of his own strength and always calibrated it, and she felt his face against her hair and his breath uneven for the first time she could remember, and she held him back without calculation. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. "A child," he said again, differently, as if the word was becoming real by repetition. "You can stop saying it," she said against his shoulder. "It won't become less true." She felt him laugh, that low, genuine, rarely deployed laugh. "I know," he said. He pulled back to look at her. His eyes were very bright. "I was not expecting my life to contain this much," he said. "It has been an eventful 2 years," she agreed. The child arrived in October of 1884, and he was a boy they named Thomas, after Grace's father. He was born healthy and opinionated, and with a great deal to say about the conditions of his arrival, and he came into the world in the farmhouse bedroom, while Mrs. Haverstock assisted, and Frederick waited in the kitchen below, with a patience that Grace would later tease him about extensively, because he had apparently reorganized the kitchen cupboards twice in the course of waiting, which was an activity he denied, and which was contradicted by the entirely new arrangement of the crockery. Thomas Underwood Townsend grew into a stout, curious, loud-laughing child who followed his mother around the farm with the devotion of a duckling, and followed his father around on sheriff's days with an expression of concentrated admiration that Frederick found simultaneously endearing and alarming, given that he preferred his family as far from the riskier aspects of his work as geography permitted. The farm prospered. They hired a farmhand named Jacob, a young man from Ohio who had come west looking for work and stayed because Grace was fair and Frederick's presence lent the property a security that made it a desirable place to work. The apple orchard began producing at the scale Grace had envisioned 5 years ago when she planted it. The wheat fields returned solid yields through the mid-1880s, benefiting from the improved market prices and Grace's methodical approach to soil management. And the relationship between them deepened in the way that the best relationships deepen, not through drama or crisis, though they had had both, but through the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of days, the texture of shared mornings and shared work and shared worry and shared laughter, until the boundary between one life and the other had dissolved so entirely that neither of them could remember being separate persons in a way that felt anything other than incomplete. Frederick, who had spent 8 years moving between towns, who had arrived in Caldwell with a dark past and a carefully maintained distance from anything that required him to be permanently available to someone else, had discovered that he was, in fact, a man who wanted exactly this: the accountability of love, the daily choice of a specific person, the farm's routine and Grace's voice in the mornings and the weight of the baby, then the toddler. Then the child who said, "Papa," with the confidence of someone who had never doubted for a moment that the man wearing the sheriff's star belonged entirely to him. 3 years into Frederick's tenure as sheriff of Sumner County, he was re-elected unopposed. Caldwell had indeed become more civilized. The last of the wild cattle drive seasons had passed by 1885, and the town was investing in schools and churches and the infrastructure of a place that intended to be permanent. Frederick's tenure was credited by the town council with having established a standard of law enforcement that attracted rather than repelled settlement, which was the kind of specific, practical achievement that Frederick considered more meaningful than any dramatic frontier narrative. In the autumn of 1886, when Thomas was 2 years old and the apple harvest was underway, Grace told Frederick she thought they might be expecting again. "Again," he said, with the same expression as the first time, the careful restraint, the thing underneath, the unguarded happiness emerging through the cracks. "Again," she confirmed, smiling at him. This time he did not reorganize the kitchen cupboards. He sat with her on the east-facing porch in the October evening, his arm around her shoulders, and they watched Thomas attempt to communicate with a barn cat that had presented itself on the porch steps, and the conversation the child was conducting with the cat was extremely one-sided but deeply earnest. "Thomas," Frederick said. The boy looked up. "Leave the cat to its business." Thomas considered this advisory for a moment, decided it lacked sufficient authority to override his scientific interest in the cat, and turned back to the cat. Frederick sighed with the patient resignation of a man who recognized his own stubbornness in someone significantly smaller than himself. Grace laughed. She laughed with her whole body, the way she laughed now, without calculation, without the careful management of expression that she had maintained through the long, difficult year before she came to Caldwell. He watched her laugh and felt the familiar pull of something he was no longer reluctant to name. "What?" she said, catching him watching. "Nothing," he said. "Frederick, I was thinking that I am very glad," he said, "that I went to that auction." She looked at him. The October evening was golden around them, the orchard dark and heavy at the western edge of the property, the child still in conversation with the cat, the farm settled and whole around them in the particular way of a thing that has been fought for and kept. "So am I," she said. The second child was born in the spring of 1887, another boy, whom they named Daniel after Frederick's father, which seemed right, and which made Frederick quiet for a long time in the good way, the way of a man processing something that had landed deeply. Daniel was a different creature than his brother, quieter, more observant, more patient, with Frederick's gray eyes and a considering quality to his gaze that made Grace laugh and say he was going to be a lawman or a judge, definitely, because that expression had no other possible origin. Thomas grew, Daniel grew, the farm grew. Frederick served the county as its sheriff with the same methodical, principled competence he had brought to everything he did, and the county's crime rate did not become a boast, but did become a quiet assurance, the kind that comes from people knowing that the man with the badge would actually do what he said. In 1889, Grace organized the establishment of a cooperative among the small farms in the area surrounding Caldwell, a buying and selling arrangement that allowed individual farmers to negotiate collectively with grain buyers and suppliers, reducing the margin that the buyers took at the expense of the producers. It was a practical, significant improvement in the economic circumstances of 23 families, and it was accomplished through the same combination of clear thinking, direct argument, and relentless follow-through that had recovered the Underwood farm from Victor Crane's trap 7 years earlier. Frederick attended the cooperative's organizational meeting as a private citizen rather than as sheriff, which Grace had asked him to do, because she did not want the authority of his office influencing negotiations that ought to be conducted purely on their merits. He sat in the back of the room at the Caldwell Grange Hall and watched her run the meeting with the quiet, focused pleasure of a man watching someone he admires doing what they are meant to do. Afterward, walking back to where their horses were tied, he said, "Your father would have been proud of you." She took his hand. They walked for a moment in the early spring evening, the town around them doing its ordinary end-of-day business, and she thought about Thomas Underwood, the tired, good man who had broken himself over his land and been broken further by the world's casual cruelty, and who had raised a daughter sharp enough to fight back and stubborn enough to win. "He would have liked you," she said. "You think so?" "He would have pretended to be suspicious of you for longer than was necessary," she said, "because he would have needed to be sure you were good enough, and his standard was quite high. But yes, he would have liked you very much eventually." Frederick considered this. "What would have convinced him?" "The auction," she said simply. "He would have heard about what you did at the auction, and that would have been sufficient." He squeezed her hand. "The lien filing was the actual legal mechanism," he said. "The auction appearance was mostly theater." "Frederick." "Yes, let it be the auction," she said. "It is an excellent story." He laughed. The spring evening opened around them, wide and ordinary and full of light, and Grace Underwood Townsend leaned her head briefly against the shoulder of the man she had built her life with, the man who had stepped forward in a dusty square in August of 1882 and spoken for her farm, and in doing so had, without either of them knowing it at the time, spoken for far more than that. The years continued to write themselves, as years do, in the quiet language of ordinary days becoming extraordinary lives. Thomas, at 8 years old, developed a passion for horses that had Frederick accepting the fact that eventually there would be more horses on the Townsend farm than was strictly practical. Daniel, at 6, began to read before his older brother had, which produced a sibling dynamic that Grace monitored with amusement and Frederick mediated with the careful fairness of a man who had extensive professional experience with disputes, and found that much of what he had learned applied directly to the small jurisdiction of his own family. In the spring of 1892, Frederick came home from a difficult week in Caldwell, a property dispute that had threatened to become violent before he had managed to reduce it, through patient negotiation, to a series of documented agreements, and found Grace on the porch in the evening light with a letter in her hand and an expression he had not seen on her face in a long time. "What is it?" he said, sitting beside her. She handed him the letter. It was from Elias Sutter, in Colorado, not a letter she would have expected, from a man she had not heard from in nearly 10 years. Sutter was old now and sick, and the letter was the kind that sick old men write when they are reviewing the accounting of their lives and finding certain entries in need of amendment. He had written to say that he was sorry. Not an elaborate apology, a simple, direct one. He had known what Crane was doing. He had been afraid, and he had complied, and then he had testified, and it had cost him his livelihood and the security he had imagined for himself. But the truth was he should have refused at the beginning, before a woman had to fight in a courthouse to keep her father's land. He was sorry for his part in what had happened. He also wrote that he had heard through the kind of frontier telegraph that passed news across distances through improbable connections, that Grace had kept her farm and married the deputy who had stood up at the auction, and that they had children and a cooperative and a life that sounded like the right outcome. He was glad. Grace had read the letter several times before Frederick arrived. She read it once more while he held it. Then she folded it and held it in her lap and was quiet for a moment. "What will you write back?" Frederick asked. "That I accept his apology," she said. "That I'm glad he testified when it mattered, even if it took courage to get there. That I hope Colorado has been kind to him." She paused. "That it worked out." Frederick nodded. They sat on the east-facing porch, where they had sat hundreds of times before, the farm spread in every direction, the apple orchard dark and enormous now, 10 years of growth making it something her father had imagined and she had brought fully into existence. The boys were somewhere visible in the middle distance, Thomas trying to teach Daniel something with a rope that Daniel was skeptical about. The evening was coming in long and golden and peaceful. "It worked out," Frederick said. "It did," Grace said. She leaned against him, the comfortable, unself-conscious lean of a person who knows exactly where they belong, and he put his arm around her with the same unself-consciousness, the same complete and settled certainty, and the Kansas evening moved around them in its unhurried way. She thought about August of 1882, and a deputy stepping into a crowd with a document in his hand and a voice that cut through everything. She thought about what she had not known then, that the man who had stepped forward was carrying his own hidden weight, his own dark past, his own secret need to make right what he had once, in another town, in another crisis, allowed to go wrong. She thought about the way two broken things can fit together and make something whole. Frederick thought about a farm he had never seen, belonging to a woman who had arrived in Caldwell with $13.40, and a determination so complete it was almost physically visible, and how he had looked at her standing on the boardwalk of Main Street and had felt something move in him that he had not been prepared for, and had spent 6 weeks carefully not examining while he focused on the practical problem in front of them. And how the practical problem had turned into a legal victory, and the legal victory had turned into an evening on a porch with coffee in the dark, and the evening on the porch had turned into this, the whole generous architecture of a shared life. 2 children and an apple orchard and a farm recovered from theft and a career that meant something and a love he had not known, he was still capable of, and had been astonished by and was not, even now, fully used to the scale of, even though it had been 10 years and counting. Thomas and Daniel came back across the field, arguing companionably about the rope lesson, and Grace called out that supper would be in 20 minutes, and Frederick watched his sons cross the yard and felt the fullness of the moment in every part of him, the particular quality of happiness that does not announce itself loudly, but is simply there, reliable and present, the way the best things are. The farm endured. The family grew. The years accumulated like the growth rings of the apple trees, each one adding something, each one containing the evidence of what had come before. And at the center of it, constant and particular and entirely themselves, were Grace Underwood Townsend and Frederick Townsend, who had found each other in the most unlikely of places and had built, out of stubbornness and principle, and the slow courage of people learning to trust again, a life that was everything a life ought to be. In later years, when Thomas was grown and married with children of his own, and Daniel was practicing law in Wellington, which turned out to have been exactly what the gray eyes and considering expression had been forecasting, and the farm had expanded through careful management to 60 acres of productive land, and Frederick had served as sheriff of Sumner County for 15 years before retiring to the farm full-time, Grace would sometimes tell the story of the auction to anyone willing to listen. She would tell it simply, without embellishment, because the plain facts were dramatic enough. A forged document, a stolen farm, a crowd in a summer square, and a deputy with a star on his chest, and a document in his hand who stepped forward and said 4 words that changed everything. And people would ask, "But did you love him right then?" And she would smile, the direct, unhurried smile of a woman who had built something real, and she would say, "I loved him when he rode to Wellington in the middle of the night to file the right paperwork. I loved him when he spent his own money on an expert witness. I loved him when he told me the truth about Martha, and when he did not try to protect me from the difficulty of what we were doing, and when he said 'we' instead of assuming." She would pause. "I loved him long before either of us said so. The auction was where it started, but love is not a single moment. It is every choice a person makes to show up and to stay, and to keep choosing the person standing beside them. And Frederick, if he was present for this telling, would listen to the whole account without interrupting, and at the end he would simply say, "The lien filing was the actual legal mechanism." And Grace would say, "Let it be the auction, Frederick." And he would smile, that full, rare, genuine smile that she had made her life's quiet work to produce as often as possible, and say, "All right, let it be the auction." And the Kansas sky would be whatever it was that day, summer enormous or winter close or spring tentative, and the farm would be there around them, real and enduring, the 40 acres that had been fought for and kept, the ground beneath everything, the home they had made of the life they had chosen, every single day, for all the years that followed. Without exception and without regret.